The envelope was waiting for me on the coffee table when I returned from work. Its deep crimson color stood out starkly against the muted tones of my apartment, a vivid anomaly. There was no postmark, no return address, just my name scrawled in an elegant, looping script across the front. I hesitated, feeling the first twinge of unease. I lived alone. No one had access to my apartment, and I hadn't ordered anything unusual. Yet here it was, unbidden and mysterious. I peeled it open carefully, my fingers trembling despite myself. Inside was an ornate card, the kind you'd find in an antique shop rather than a stationery store. Gold filigree bordered the edges, and the faint scent of roses wafted up as I unfolded it. You are cordially invited to an exclusive Valentine's masquerade. The location was listed, a grand estate on the outskirts of the city. A time, 9 p.m., and beneath it all, a single line written in the same looping hand. Your destiny awaits. Nestled within the folds of the invitation was a mask, heart-shaped and intricately designed with swirling patterns of crimson and gold. The texture was odd, smooth like silk, but with an almost imperceptible pulse under my fingertips, as though it were alive. The rational part of me screamed to toss it away. It was probably a prank or an elaborate marketing ploy. Yet something about the mask called to me, tugging at my curiosity. By the time the evening rolled around, I had convinced myself there was no harm in attending. A grand Valentine's ball sounded harmless, even charming. If nothing else, it would be a night of spectacle. When I placed the mask over my face, a strange sensation rippled through me, a warmth spreading from my temples down to my chest. For a fleeting moment, I heard a faint whisper, but the sound disappeared as quickly as it had come. The cab ride to the estate was uneventful, but the sight that greeted me when we arrived was anything but. The mansion was enormous, its Gothic spires piercing the starless sky. Every window flickered with golden light, but no music or laughter spilled out. It was silent, save for the occasional rustle of wind through the barren trees lining the driveway. A doorman in a black suit opened the grand double doors as I approached. He said nothing, only gestured for me to enter. Inside, the air was perfumed with roses and candle wax, and the dim lighting cast long, wavering shadows across the marble floor. Guests milled about, each wearing a mask more elaborate than the last. Their movements were strange, almost synchronized, and though the room was full, it felt oppressively quiet. I swallowed hard, gripping the edges of my mask. That same whisper tickled the back of my mind, indistinct but persistent. My heart quickened. "Welcome," a voice purred beside me. I turned to see a tall figure in a mask much like mine, though his was a shade darker and bore an etched emblem, a rose pierced by a thorn. "You've taken the first step," he said, his voice smooth and unplaceable. "The mask suits you. It always does." Before I could question him, he melted into the crowd, leaving me with a sense of disorientation and dread. I didn't remember leaving the ball. One moment, I was standing amidst the flickering candles and masked figures. The next, I was waking up in my bed, the mask resting on my nightstand. I stared at it, heart pounding. Had I taken it off last night? I couldn't recall. Yet there it was, pristine and gleaming in the early morning light. As I got ready for work, I couldn't shake the unease that clung to me like a second skin. Something about last night felt fractured, like a dream I couldn't quite piece together. It wasn't until I was brushing my hair in front of the mirror that the whisper returned. "You looked beautiful last night." I froze, the hairbrush clattering to the floor. The words were faint, almost inaudible, but unmistakably there. I turned, half expecting someone to be standing behind me. The room was empty. Slowly, I faced the mirror again. My reflection stared back, pale and wide-eyed. "Beautiful," the whisper repeated, this time softer. I grabbed the mask from my nightstand and shoved it into a drawer. The whisper stopped. My pulse was still racing as I rushed out the door. The day passed in a blur, every noise making me jump, every shadow seeming too long, too deep. By the time I got home, I was ready to collapse. But when I stepped inside, the mask was back on my nightstand. My chest tightened. I knew I'd put it in the drawer. I'd locked the drawer. The whisper came again, louder this time. "It belongs to you now." I yanked the mask off the table and threw it into the closet, slamming the door shut. My hands were shaking as I leaned against it, willing myself to breathe. Hours passed before I dared to check. The closet was dark, the mask hidden beneath a pile of old clothes. Yet even then, as I lay in bed, I felt its presence, heavy and watchful. That night, my dreams were filled with gilded masks and endless whispers, their words tangling into one repeating phrase: "You're chosen." The days that followed were a waking nightmare. Every effort I made to rid myself of the mask failed. I hid it, buried it, even tried to throw it away. But no matter where I left it, the mask always reappeared, gleaming, pristine, and waiting. The whispers had become a constant presence. At first, they were soft and sporadic, barely discernible over the hum of daily life. But now, they followed me everywhere, weaving themselves into the silence like a sinister melody. It wasn't just the whispers. The mask began calling to me in other ways, compelling me to hold it, wear it. The sensation was insidious, starting as a nagging thought and growing into an unbearable urge. By the time the second invitation arrived, I was no longer surprised. It was identical to the first. Crimson envelope, ornate card, same golden filigree. Only the time and location had changed. This time the masquerade was set to take place in an abandoned theater downtown, a place I'd heard of but never visited. The invitation was explicit. Wear the mask. It will guide you. The idea of returning terrified me, yet I felt a pull I couldn't resist, as though the mask was part of me now, something I couldn't sever, no matter how much I wanted to. When the night came, I found myself dressing with care, selecting a deep red gown to match the mask's ornate design. As I placed it over my face, a familiar warmth spread through me, along with a sense of anticipation I didn't understand. The theater was just as foreboding as the mansion had been. Its once grand facade was crumbling, vines creeping over the marble columns. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and decay, and the flickering light of hundreds of candles cast strange shadows across the walls. Masked figures drifted through the auditorium, their movements graceful yet unnervingly synchronized. I recognized some of them from the first masquerade, though their masks were more elaborate now, adorned with strange symbols and designs that seemed almost alive. As I stepped further into the theater, the whispers grew louder, forming coherent sentences that seemed to come from all directions. "This way. You are where you belong." The words were both comforting and terrifying, like a siren's song. A masked figure approached, tall and imposing, their mask adorned with jagged, gold-edged patterns. They gestured toward a staircase that led backstage, saying nothing, but making it clear I was meant to follow. The whispers intensified with each step, their tone shifting from melodic to insistent. Backstage, the air was cooler and the light dimmer. The figure stopped before a massive velvet curtain, pulling it aside to reveal a room filled with mirrors. I froze. The mirrors weren't ordinary. They were distorted, each reflecting me in a different way. In one, I looked older, my face lined with age. In another, my features were blurred, almost unrecognizable. But the one directly ahead of me was the most disturbing. In it, I wore the mask, but it wasn't a reflection. It was me, moving independently. The figure in the mirror tilted its head, studying me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The reflection didn't answer. Instead, it raised its hands, pressing them against the glass. The surface rippled like water disturbed by a pebble. "Chosen," the reflection mouthed. I stumbled back, the whispers rising to a deafening crescendo. The masked figure who had brought me here stepped forward, placing a hand on my shoulder. "It's time," they said, their voice calm but filled with purpose. "For what?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, they turned me to face the mirror again. My reflection was gone. I left the theater in a daze, the whispers quieter now but still present, threading through my thoughts like a dark undercurrent. My reflection had vanished from every mirror in my home. The mask, however, remained. It had become impossible to remove, as though it had fused to my skin. Desperation drove me to seek answers. Late one night, I returned to the theater, hoping to find some trace of the masquerade or its enigmatic participants. The building was silent, empty. No candles, no whispers, no signs that anyone had been there. But in the center of the stage, I found a single object, a journal. The leather-bound book was old, its pages yellowed and brittle. Inside were entries written in a hurried hand detailing the mask's origins. It spoke of a craftsman centuries ago who had poured his obsession into creating the masks, binding them with a curse that ensured they would find those who longed for connection yet feared vulnerability. Each mask, the journal claimed, had a unique bond with its wearer, feeding off their emotions and desires. They were meant to test the boundaries of love, though what that meant remained vague. One passage chilled me to the core. To break the mask's hold, the wearer must confront what they fear most. The mask reflects their soul. Only by accepting what lies within can they be free. I didn't know what I feared most, but the mask seemed to know. That night, the whispers turned cruel. They mocked my insecurities, dredging up memories I had buried deep. The mask felt heavier, as if it were feeding on my dread. "Confront what you fear most," the whispers urged. The next evening, I returned to the mirrors, driven by a mix of terror and determination. In the center mirror, my reflection stared back, not distorted, not blurred, but me as I was. Except, this time, the reflection spoke. "You're running," it said, its voice echoing like the whispers, "but you can't escape yourself." The truth hit me like a thunderclap. The mask wasn't the enemy. It was a mirror, forcing me to see the parts of myself I had hidden away. If I wanted freedom, I had to face it. The theater was silent when I arrived, its decayed grandeur even more haunting in the pale moonlight. The whispers had been relentless all day, their tone sharp and mocking, as though they knew this was my final chance to break free. I stepped inside, my breath clouding in the frigid air. The mask felt heavier than ever, its edges pressing against my skin like cold iron. Each step I took seemed to echo endlessly, the sound swallowed by the cavernous darkness. The mirrors awaited me backstage, their distorted reflections shifting and twisting in the dim light. I stood before the central one, my reflection staring back with the same intensity as before. The mask on its face gleamed unnaturally, as though it was alive. "You know what to do," the reflection said. Its voice, though mine, was layered with something else, an ancient knowing quality that sent chills down my spine. "I don't know how," I whispered, my voice cracking. "You do." The reflection raised its hand, and I mirrored the movement instinctively. My fingertips pressed against the cold surface of the glass, and the mirror rippled like water. Suddenly, I was pulled forward, not physically, but mentally, as though my consciousness was being drawn into the depths of the mirror. The world around me blurred, and when it sharpened again, I was no longer in the theater. I stood in an endless void, the ground beneath me smooth and reflective like polished obsidian. Shadows swirled in the distance, shapeless and formless, whispering words I couldn't understand. Ahead, the mask floated, suspended in the air, its crimson and gold pattern shimmered, and its hollow eyes seemed to watch me with an unsettling awareness. "This is the core of it," the whispers said, though they didn't come from any direction. They were inside me, reverberating through my thoughts. As I stepped closer, the mask began to change. Its surface cracked and warped, revealing glimpses of images, snapshots of moments from my life. I saw myself as a child, lonely and withdrawn. I saw the heartbreaks and failures I'd buried deep, the relationships I'd pushed away out of fear. The whispers turned cruel. Unworthy, afraid, alone. I fell to my knees, my hands clutching the smooth surface beneath me. The weight of the mask pressed down on my soul, suffocating me with its truth. It wasn't the mask that had bound me. It was my own fear, my own refusal to face the cracks in my being. But then, faintly, I heard another voice, softer, yet resolute. "You are more than this." I looked up, and the mask was no longer floating. It rested on the ground before me, cracked but still whole. Its ornate design seemed less menacing now, the gold patterns glinting faintly as if offering a glimmer of hope. I reached out, my hand trembling. As my fingers brushed the mask, warmth spread through me. Not the oppressive heat from before, but something gentle, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The whispers grew frantic, their mocking tone replaced by something that almost sounded like panic. "No, you cannot!" I placed the mask over my face, and everything went silent. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the theater. The mirrors were gone, and the stage was empty, save for a single candle flickering in the center. The mask lay at my feet, its surface dull and lifeless, like an object stripped of its power. For the first time in weeks, the whispers were gone. My reflection, when I found it later in a dusty window pane, was my own. No distortion, no mask, just me. As I stepped out into the night, the air felt lighter, the world sharper and more vivid. I knew the mask had left its mark on me, but it no longer held me captive. Even so, as I walked away from the theater, I couldn't shake the faint feeling that I was being watched. And when I glanced back just once, I thought I saw a glimmer of red in the shadows, but it was gone before I could be sure.